in these issues that revolve around motivation as an organizing and growth theme. So I want us to think about, I'm going to introduce some other exciting new terms, why teenagers are so rewardy. And we talk about this a lot, and this is in the media a lot, and maybe something that we talk about a little bit less in the field, but is also there as a lay perception. Why are they also so super selfie? Now, if you think about this, a rewarding stimulus is one that is self-reinforcing. It's more likely to be associated with positive consequences for the self, and we know that these constructs are really intimately linked, sort of at the theoretical level and at a neural level, which I'll kind of hop over and talk about for just a second. But one of the interesting things to think about here is that in prior critiques of reward models that sort of emphasize the computational approaches to reward learning, because that's sort of something tractable that we can kind of dig our teeth into, have said, knowledge itself is never motivation. And the theme that I got from both of these talks is that, well, in this stage, like you were pointing out, Linda, learning about self, learning about the world, your place in the world, what do you like, what do you want, what do you need, that probably is in and of itself rewarding. And teens can be really wired for this. So I want to add another little conceptual layer here of exciting questions. Why do teens care so much about what their peers think of them? We know that social self-concept and social status and sort of identity become really increasingly critical factors in the value that teenagers assign to potentially rewarding stimuli and behaviors and situations. So I think what we see here now is this collective influence of processes related to reward, to the self, and to social cognition on all these kinds of motivated behavior during adolescence. Such that you can think of over time, social feedback, both positive and negative, appraisals from others, shapes not just an individual adolescent's self-concept or self-views, but their implicit behavioral dispositions in certain contexts of what behaviors are they going to be drawn towards. And this can certainly have both positive and negative consequences. We tend to focus on the negative, but something we want to sort of emphasize here is also trying to bring out the positive. Okay. So, the last conceptual point I want to make is related to affective meaning. So I mean here, I sort of mentioned this appetitive feeling of wanting or liking something. Want to be popular. I like that boy. I want him to kiss me. I want to make varsity athletics. I want to get into the college of my choice. These things all provide sort of this motivational pull towards your goals. So we are getting into future orientation here, like Dasha was talking about. And assigning value to a behavior, whether it's now or in the future, involves generating this kind of affective meaning. So it's sort of a psychological tool to integrate the environmental and sort of interoceptive cues that are helping you prospect about the future, prospective cognition, so that you can consolidate all this kind of information you're experiencing, these teens are experiencing in their rich social worlds, into just something is readily accessible to them, a feeling state. And so I think that's what I want to say conceptually. If you look at the neural level, these same connections are evident. So we know that there's a core, common, shared and interconnected regions that support self-evaluative processing and also reward processing and social cognition, including particularly ventromedial, PFC, and orbitofrontal cortex, the ventral striatum, but also posterior cortical midline structures and the temporal parietal junction. And I think one thing we're all very interested in here as a group is about how pubertal changes could initiate sort of a cascade in this neural hardware for value computation. So really transforming the way that social feedback that adolescents are getting shapes their motivation. And again, we have a range here. We could be talking about very high level, generalized, explicit self-concept, or you could be talking about, again, these implicit tendencies or behavioral predispositions. So just to wrap up, a couple of new directions that I think about, we think about a lot, that are exciting. We want to really push for considering the appetitive feelings, the wanting, the liking, that shape motivational goals and experiential learning. Another important thing, I think, and as somebody who has spent a lot of time dabbling in this self-evaluative space, it's a very fuzzy space, and I think something that people studying this neurally can glean from folks who've used much more computational models to approach things like reward learning is that would be a good direction for us to go, make that these kinds of approaches more computational. And on the same side, or sort of on the flip side, I think that thinking about reward in a more personalized and contextualized fashion, sort of drawing those lessons would push sort of all of these fields forward sort of in an integrative way. And I think the last thing is really trying to explore when amplified reward, self-evaluative, and sort of social cognitive processes and these emphases in adolescence foster resilience or create sort of optimal conditions for personal growth, sort of, as was brought up in Terry's lecture. So I'm going to leave this to Adriana to discuss further, but hopefully these are some just exciting ideas to get everyone in the room thinking about. So thank you.
I don't have any more formal comments. I would really love to hear. We've heard such great talks, and I was going through my notes of questions I want to ask Linda, and there are just so many. Because every time I hear animal work, I just get so excited about all the things you can do it, we can't do it, we want to know it. But I would love to hear more comments from the audience. We haven't really had an opportunity for discussion. So, are there any comments that we haven't addressed? Especially for Roger stuff. Yeah?
By the way, fantastic talks. Thank you, Mark, for bringing everyone together. Just really fantastic. Well, one thing that comes to mind, I think, now that Jennifer brought up some of these issues and so forth, is hopefully I'm not just talking about myself, but even as an adult, you have very motivational driven behaviors. Mm-hmm. So it's a system that is there very early on, even, we saw this with the mice being very young and having this driven behavior. So what is the emerging thinking of what makes it so unique in this early development? Is there something unique that's underlined by a different system completely that has to do with, it's social, it's this or that, using an attack motivational system? Or is it that, the proposal of increased dopamine availability is just accentuating something that is always there? Because, of course, we are always interested in peers and social situations, so it's not exclusive to that period. So I'm wondering what you're thinking. Anyway.
I really believe that proportion of the brain that's plastic, the fact that there's so much more proportion of the neurons that can be rewired earlier on, is going to make this kind of putty of the cortex much more modifiable, and dopamine and all these other things can probably act on it with more force at that age, at younger ages. And I don't know enough yet from the mice whether to say that there's a U-shaped function there, or if it's just sort of monotonic decay and what's going on in terms of stabilization of the circuits. But I feel like that's, we can point to that as being interesting in interacting with dopamine, for example.
So I'm going to make a bold set of suggestions, because you I think what you posed is really an important one. And again, we need to really ground these in more specificity and test this. But I think one of the emerging sets of ideas that a group of us have been discussing is that, of course, young children have patterns of motivation and particularly related to social as well as other reward systems. And of course, adults are motivated similarly. And I think that the idea that what we believe may happen around the onset of puberty is that the relative increase in salience of social rewards. Yes, kids like to be admired, adults like to be admired. Their behaviors and motivations are going to be shaped by things like social approval and admiration. But there very well could be an increase in the relative value or salience. And that by itself is interesting. But I think when we think about the broader clinical, social opportunities for intervention level question, the idea is that if, in fact, that's true, that social processes are going to be shaping these motivations, that young people are basically experimenting with their social niche, what are the ways they are going to be admired within their social context, that may then shape other intrinsic motivations. They self-identify with particular kinds of goals, activities, effortful extension of their goal-directed behaviors in ways that then have enduring effects. These are testable. These are testable hypotheses. But if that is true, we think this has implications not only for what's been studied for a decade or more in terms of vulnerability to these negative acquired motivations, impediment motivations, which that's this much stronger neuroscience, but also for a broad range of positive social motivations. The attaching these igniting passions, these strong motivational tendencies to particular kinds of goals, including pro-social goals, including adaptive, healthy kinds of goals, create opportunities. Understanding how these processes occur and coming up with tractable ways to interrogate these development systems relevant to these kinds of models, I think is part of some of the shared questions people are raising. And now let me shift from the large abstract to a specific set of things that we talk about a lot. How to compare social goals with monetary goals. How to come up with tasks that really let us pit those against each other in ways to test these models. I mean, these are themes that keep coming up again and again. And you think about how to test these across different models in different ways. And we think that there are conceptual and methodological challenges to addressing these issues. But it gets back to, I think, the point that Terry raised really wonderfully in her talk. If we really are going to advance the field in an integrative way, tackling complex questions with teams of people slicing into these issues in different ways is really, I think, one of the exciting ways that this kind of progress is going to happen. And they are big questions. They're really tough questions. I like the example of like pediatric HIV. I'm a pediatrician. The idea that there are times when people rally around a complex problem in areas of pediatric cancer or immunization that have transformed what happens. When you see people do that with complex issues, that you could be easily cynical. How do you change these really complex issues? And you see scientists across many levels coming together, tackling real-world problems in teams. It's very inspiring. And I think in some ways we're so early, especially in social and affective, developmental social and affective neuroscience, but I think creating teams, they're tackling a line of question and compelling big questions, even though they're really complicated, is what we believe is an exciting frontier. And motivation is really a tough, people have been studying motivation for 100 years, and they mean very different things by motivation. And I think that's part of what I liked about Jen's conceptual questions. Even conceptually, understanding the affective dimensions, how social experiences shape aspects of motivation, and how motivational learning occurring during different windows of development may occur, I think really could leverage very high impact social policy, early intervention, education questions. So that's one set of ideas. Monique.
Yeah, I mean, that was really great talks and thanks, and all these ideas are coming out.
Do you want to come to the microphone, Monique?
Okay.
Is someone who's thought a lot about these questions?
I mean, what I want to say is, I believed on the self, and because during adolescence, this is a time when the self is really emerging. One is asking, who am I? You know, the body is changing, and maybe we don't pay attention enough to that because you judge yourself as a function of the outside. You have no other way to build yourself, and so looking at the other reflects you, and so where is the self? I mean, because this is the main thing that is developing in adolescence. And I think this is like
Well, I personally think that's a very exciting question and something that I try to think about a lot. I think I think focusing on the contributions of various self-evaluative processes, not just, in part seeing yourself and others, but also this process of trying to see how people see you is one that I think is critical to adolescent development, because in trying to take the other perspective on the self and in trying to see, you're gleaning that social feedback that's going to shape you towards, you know what, you just don't have the skills to make it on, you're not going to be the varsity volleyball team, you better pick a bit different direction for your high school career, right? So this kind of learning is going to, I think, it's really potent, I guess, to say. And so we've been trying to start looking at it, but it's because it's so rich and complex, it's this sort of fuzzy target that becomes, I think the real key, and I said it before, is how do we break it down a little more computationally? I can't calculate the delayed discounting factor the way that voucher can, so how do we get to that next step? I think that you're absolutely right, we want to integrate this, but we need more people interested in that level of analysis, and in integrating that level of analysis and looking at it from different perspectives to really move forward on that front. I don't know, that's what I want to say.
But I think also that in a way motivation feeds the self. So, I mean, I've just looked at it now. So, but I think trying to define self, we may really get some things with that, because this is what's really changing. I mean, a little kid up to 8, 9 years old, you don't feel the self, but then you start really asking yourself, who am I?
I just want to make one other comment in relation to this idea of beginning to parse components of this very complex, obviously these are really complex issues. And I was thinking of, Sarah Jane Blakemore isn't here, but I think we've had a lot of discussions about one component that's really much more cognitive, perspective taking about self, that really would map onto neural systems involved in cognitive perspective taking about yourself. But I think there's also an affective dimension of self-perspective, feelings about yourself that is going to overlap and they're going to communicate, but they're really different components. And when you really look at some of the intriguing puzzles about puberty and early adolescence, these feelings about self and how quickly they shift from grandiose because something positive's happened to crushed, hopeless days because somebody looked the other way or didn't return your call. These experiences are shaping the affective dimensions of self. And again, these are complex issues, but these are also tractable questions. And I think that there are increasingly people modeling the social value components to these processes and computational processes, and I think this is really exciting. We cut Wouter off before he could get to the social dimension of some of these studies and some really clever tasks that he and others have been working on along these lines. And again, part of this is just the time, but I think these social and affective dimensions, as well as the social cognitive dimensions, are really, really important. And then when we think about disorders and mental disorders, these dimensions are harder, but in many ways probably at least as salient, if not more salient.
on what I think both of you are saying. Maybe it relates to what Monique was saying, is I find it interesting the idea of the increased salience of the social cues in adolescence, and I wonder sometimes, is it that the salience increases during adolescence, or is it that there isn't sufficient accumulated experience or wisdom, shall we say, to manage the salience that could even be static throughout life? So, for example, we all care a lot throughout our whole lives about the social reactions that we get to what we say or how we perform, but our ability to manage that as a function of our experience, our working memory, the connectivity that was being talked about just in the prior talk. So I wonder if there are tasks that could somehow distinguish that in adolescence.
No, I see your point, but I think there's a difference also in the developmental task that you have initially. What you say is finding out the self, and that's really, as Monique said, in relation to others. And of course, that's a very difficult task, and then I think very important at that point. And I think later in life, you might still be very interested in what other people think, but you sort of figured out, at least partly, I hope, your identity. So I guess you can also pay attention to other things. So I guess you're solving that problem, this identity problem, in relation to the other people, and that's just a really big job that you have to do during that period. So I guess that makes this feedback part more serious. It is just more important, maybe.
This is somewhat tangential, but I have some experimental data. When we're studying mice, we're studying a species that is pretty deprived, right? They're living in cages. But we did an experiment where we trained animals on that Cheerio task for 9 days, about 18 hours of training. And then we let them sit in the cage for a month, and maybe even a little longer. Then when we gave them all cocaine, they all liked cocaine equally well. But the animals, so they showed a preference for the location in which they had the cocaine. But the animals that had previously had this, 18 hours of cognitive training and goal-directed experience and rewards, extinguished the cocaine-seeking faster than the animals who had been in this deprived cage state the whole time. So I feel like the salience of something like a drug has much more impact on the brain and probably affects the brain in a much heavier way if you don't have other kinds of successes and things to compare it to. So I feel like the buildup of wisdom and success in some way could build resilience to other factors coming in, like your first snort.
I guess what I was just going to add, and I think it is related, is that you brought up, the mice that were in those enriched kind of condition where they're getting all these experiences with these great different smells, and I think you can think about adolescence as or not great smells. No. You can think about this as a period where maybe earlier in childhood, you have maybe somewhat more predictability and a tighter, more closed circle in terms of the environment. And as exploration becomes a priority, your environment is there's much more variability. So it also makes figuring out the feedback, I think, more complex because these more unknown peers, you aren't necessarily as certain of their feedback as you may be from a family member, from a close family member. Now, obviously, in the context of early adversity, that's kind of different. That's going to shape how teens who've grown up in that kind of circumstance learn differentially during adolescence, which is something we also talked about.
There's also the issue of novelty, because in adolescence, we say that they take a lot of risk, but and they know that they may die if they go up the mountain, but they really don't believe it. And it's all new. They don't have the experience of accidents. as much as we go older and we get more wary, and the value of the risk is possible negative outcome is increasing. And so, it might mitigate the thought that we have that adolescents are more risk-taking, although I'm the first one to say there are more, but still we have to be careful about the contribution of that type of thing, like novelty and in a new world.
Yes, I'm really excited about this idea of translational work and thinking about bridging the gap between human and animal work. But one thing I keep having in mind is this idea as we try to think about the adolescent condition now and motivation and reward, this idea of joining the varsity team or being liked on Facebook, and all of these things are so evolutionarily new, if you will, right? The brain is continuing to change, but really from a basic standpoint, we have like food and water and sex, and those are the important things for reward and motivation. So I'm wondering if perhaps in the hopes of translational work to kind of take a step back from some of these bigger, not social, you can model social behavior routines, but take a step back to really try to understand the circuitry as Linda mentioned with her rodent models, and understanding maybe the basics of adolescent motivation before getting into the bigger questions about self-identifying and self-judgment and all those things that really are kind of more evolutionarily new for our brains.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make, and in fact, I'd love to phrase it the way you did just now. I think next time we can talk. But I think it's interesting how we can build on what we've learned from sensitive period plasticity, particularly in the visual system and auditory system. What I think is so enticing to think about there is that the brain is waiting for a certain experience before it's going to unfold all this plasticity to take in, that experience. And I like to, when I think about people, I think what's really interesting is that as a social species that we have this incredible division of labor. And at adolescence, we might be not expanding our social circle, but also trying to fit in with greater society. And I don't think my mice have it, but I think that teenagers are probably waiting to see where they fit into society. There might be, I don't know what circuit, but circuits waiting to take on this task, and that there might be some trigger and something that all of you will discover and tell us about.
And I just want to add that I think that there's a wonderful set of contributions by thinking about this idea that adolescence is modern is, I think, partially a myth. There's wonderful work, and it's the best known is Alice Schlegel and her Berkeley study, Adolescence Across 188 Non-Western Societies and Hunter-Gatherer Societies, and the idea that virtually every society recognized a period that was not child and was not adult. And there's some really interesting themes. I mean, when Alice talks about the themes across these hunter-gatherer societies, adolescence was a time that your reputation wasn't from your family, it was from you and your behavior. And the reputation effects you developed as an adolescent were going to be with you forever because you were going to be with the same group of people. And this idea that you're going to experiment with a way to improve your reputation within your group and be admired, is long before we had Facebook, long before we had modern technology that changes it. But the basic idea that one may be naturally inclined to find a niche to contribute valuably to your society, and that changes tremendously across different social contexts and what those societies value and ways to contribute. And the idea that individuals would basically experiment to find ways that they were going to be admired and have positive. But it's risky, too, of course. Bold behavior that's pro-social, in some societies where to become an adult, you've got to kill your first dangerous animal with a spear. I mean, that risk-taking is pretty adoptive. But if you're in a society where, there's a lot of niches. And so I think the point is that to think about the animal work, the challenges and problems that are faced in different species, but also not just Western society and modern society, but how the best evidence about adolescence across human history, I think there's some really interesting themes. And they come back to some of these issues of self and being admired, and the plasticity, whether it's being kind or creative or the peacemaker. It's not just about being, there are a lot of ways an individual can contribute to their group. And if the group has open niches of ways to contribute, exploring and finding ways to be contributing in new ways may be part of the natural part of adolescence. And the neural systems that would underpin those tendencies to really value